Imagine a time when faith and power ruled every corner of Europe. Thrones were built not only on battles, but on marriages, piety, and influence whispered through candlelit corridors. In this world, one woman stood quietly yet firmly at the heart of an empire. Her name was Eleonora Gonzaga, an Italian princess who became the Holy Roman Empress and one of the most fascinating yet overlooked figures of the 17th century. Born in Mantua to one of Italy's most cultured dynasties, Eleonora grew up surrounded by music, art, and diplomacy. Her childhood prepared her for the life that awaited her, not one of leisure, but of purpose. When she married Ferdinand of Styria, who would later become Emperor Ferdinand II, her destiny intertwined with the story of Europe itself. Their union was more than a marriage. It was a political and spiritual alliance that shaped the course of the Holy Roman Empire during one of its darkest and most defining moments, the 30 Years' War. But Eleonora's influence was not fought on the battlefield. It was expressed in the quiet power of faith, culture, and persuasion. She turned the imperial court into a center of Baroque art and Catholic devotion, patronized composers, architects, and painters, and helped mold the image of the Habsburgs as defenders of the faith. Behind the grandeur of processions and coronations was her guiding hand, calm, steady, and devoted. Though she had no children of her own, she became a spiritual mother to her stepchildren and to a generation of nobles who looked to her for moral guidance. Her patronage helped preserve the beauty of Italian art in the cold courts of Vienna and inspired a wave of religious creativity that shaped European culture for decades. Even after the emperor's death, she continued to build convents, support the poor, and nurture the arts, living out her later years in humble devotion, yet retaining the respect of emperors and cardinals alike. In her, we find the story of a woman who balanced duty with faith, elegance with strength. She was not a ruler by name, but a leader in spirit, a symbol of endurance in a world of uncertainty. Through Eleonora Gonzaga, we can see how influence is not always loud or visible. Sometimes it works through grace, intellect, and conviction. This is not just a story about one empress. It's about the power of quiet resilience in an age of chaos, the union of art and faith, and the legacy of a woman who helped define the Baroque world without ever commanding an army or wearing a crown in battle. Her story reminds us that history's greatest figures are often those who worked in silence, but changed the world in lasting ways. Welcome to Words of Time. In this video, we explore the remarkable life of Eleonora Gonzaga, the Italian-born Holy Roman Empress who shaped the spirit of an empire through faith, art, and quiet strength. Stay with us as we uncover how her life connected two worlds, Renaissance Italy and the Baroque Habsburg Empire, and how her influence still echoes through the corridors of European history. Eleonora Gonzaga, born in 1598, occupies an important yet often understated position within the history of the Habsburg dynasty. As the Italian-born wife of Emperor Ferdinand II, she lived at the intersection of dynastic politics, religion, and art during one of the most complex periods in European history. Her life reflects the intricate balance between personal piety, political diplomacy, and the ceremonial expectations of imperial queenship. Studying her career provides insight not only into her own actions and influence, but also into the broader mechanisms of power and culture that define the early modern world. The purpose of this study is to present Eleonora Gonzaga as a figure whose story bridges two powerful traditions: the refined Italian court culture of Mantua and the austere, deeply religious environment of the Habsburg monarchy. Her biography cannot be separated from the great political and religious forces that shaped the early 17th century. She was not a passive observer, but a woman who, through marriage, diplomacy, and patronage, became part of the machinery that sustained the Habsburg Empire at its height. At the same time, she embodied the ideals of Catholic womanhood that the Counter-Reformation promoted: virtue, devotion, and service to faith and family. The focus of examining Eleonora's life must therefore be twofold. First, it should trace the events of her personal journey from Mantua to Vienna, her upbringing in an Italian princely household, her marriage into the imperial family, and her years as empress. Second, it must consider how her life unfolded within the wider European stage, a landscape defined by political tension, religious warfare, and artistic flourishing. By combining these perspectives, we gain a fuller understanding of how individual lives could influence and reflect the broader historical patterns of their age. At the beginning of the 17th century, Europe was deeply divided. The political order inherited from the Renaissance had begun to fracture under the pressure of confessional conflict and territorial ambition. The Protestant Reformation of the previous century had split the continent's religious unity, and Catholic monarchs now sought to restore it through both persuasion and force. Within this setting, dynastic marriages became essential tools of diplomacy. They linked kingdoms and duchies through bonds of blood, helping to sustain alliances and shape political balance. It was within this web of family strategy that Eleonora Gonzaga's marriage to Ferdinand II was arranged. The Habsburg family stood at the center of this turbulent world. By the early 1700s, they controlled vast territories across Central Europe and beyond, from Austria and Bohemia to the Spanish realms. Their power rested not only on military and political strength, but also on the image of divine favor. The Catholic resurgence that followed the Council of Trent reinforced their claim to rule as defenders of the faith. Art, ceremony, and religion were all employed to strengthen that image. In this climate, the role of an empress was crucial. Her conduct, her household, and her patronage of the church reflected on the legitimacy and moral standing of the dynasty itself. Italy, where Eleonora was born, was a vital part of this system, even though it was not united as a single nation. The peninsula was divided into duchies, republics, and kingdoms, each tied to larger European powers through a network of diplomacy and marriage. Mantua, ruled by the Gonzaga family, was one of these small but culturally rich states. The Gonzagas had long cultivated connections with the Habsburgs, offering loyalty in return for protection and prestige. Through marriage alliances, they maintained influence far beyond the Po Valley. By giving a daughter in marriage to the future emperor, the Gonzagas strengthened their standing while the Habsburgs secured an ally in northern Italy, a region strategically important during the conflicts that defined the early 17th century. Understanding Eleonora's world requires attention to the sources that record it. The material available to historians is diverse but fragmentary. Surviving correspondence reveals her involvement in court affairs and her communication with family members and religious figures. Official documents, including dowry contracts and court accounts, provide insight into her financial and administrative role. Jesuit writings describe her religious patronage and her example as a pious consort. Portraits and engravings offer another layer of evidence, showing how she was represented to the public as both sovereign and model of virtue. Each source contributes pieces to a complex picture, though none alone can capture the full extent of her influence. Modern historians rely not only on these primary materials, but also on a growing body of secondary research concerning the Habsburg court and the role of women within it. Earlier scholarship tended to treat imperial consorts as background figures, emphasizing their ceremonial function rather than their agency. More recent studies, however, explore how women like Eleonora Gonzaga participated in diplomacy, patronized the arts, and shaped religious culture. The growing interest in female patronage has revealed that empresses and noblewomen were not merely symbols of dynastic union, but active contributors to the social and cultural life of their courts. The Mantuan background also offers valuable context for understanding Eleonora's tastes and values. Mantua, under the Gonzagas, was one of the most sophisticated courts in Italy, known for its painters, architects, and musicians. The city's cultural atmosphere influenced Eleonora's later support for the arts in Vienna. Scholars of Mantuan politics have also highlighted how the Gonzagas balanced their autonomy with dependence on stronger neighbors. Their ability to survive through diplomacy, marriage, and cultural prestige prepared Eleonora well for life in the far more complex setting of the Habsburg monarchy. Despite the richness of sources, reconstructing the political influence of women in the 17th century remains difficult. Much of their activity took place in private correspondence or informal settings that left few official traces. The structure of early modern government did not record the advice, mediation, or advocacy performed by royal consorts. Historians must therefore read between the lines, comparing personal letters with court decisions and public events to identify moments when women's interventions made a difference. In Eleonora's case, her influence likely appeared in the careful selection of court officials, the management of her household, and her sponsorship of religious foundations that strengthened the emperor's Catholic image. The challenge of writing about Eleonora Gonzaga, then, lies in balancing the limited evidence of her personal voice with the broader context of her time. Her story cannot be told as that of an isolated figure, nor can it be reduced to a simple narrative of devotion. She was part of a system where politics, family strategy, and faith were inseparable. By examining her life within that system, historians can better understand how the ideals of pious queenship functioned in practice and how women shaped the identity of the Habsburg Empire. This introduction sets the foundation for exploring her life in detail. It places her within the turbulent world of early 17th-century Europe, defines the sources through which we know her, and outlines the questions that guide historical inquiry. Through Eleonora Gonzaga's story, we can trace the intersection of gender, power, and faith in the age when the Habsburgs stood at the height of their authority and the Catholic world sought to rebuild its spiritual and political unity. The story of Eleonora Gonzaga continues naturally from the world that shaped her birth. She entered life surrounded by power, art, and ceremony, in an Italy divided by politics yet united by the pursuit of cultural excellence. Her character, tastes, and outlook were formed in a court that had long been one of the most refined in Europe. To understand the woman who would later stand beside Emperor Ferdinand II, it is necessary to see first the environment that produced her. A family whose name carried centuries of history, a city that had become a jewel of Renaissance creativity, and a set of values that joined devotion, pride, and diplomacy. The Gonzaga family had ruled Mantua for nearly 2 centuries when Eleonora was born. They rose from local nobility to princely status during the late Middle Ages, when shrewd politics and careful alliances secured their control over a territory strategically placed between Milan and Venice. Mantua itself was small but wealthy, protected by surrounding lakes and sustained by agriculture, trade, and the patronage of artists. The Gonzagas understood early that culture could be a form of power. They filled their palaces with painters, musicians, poets, and architects, turning their city into a stage where refinement and political legitimacy worked hand in hand. The family's combination of military skill and artistic vision made Mantua famous across the Italian peninsula. By the time Eleonora's father, Vincenzo I, came to power, the Gonzagas had reached their peak. He was a man of commanding ambition and extravagant taste, eager to maintain Mantua's reputation as a cultural capital. Under his rule, the court attracted some of the most talented figures of the late Renaissance, including Claudio Monteverdi, who composed music for the Gonzaga Theatre, and Peter Paul Rubens, who painted portraits and mythological scenes for the ducal palaces. Vincenzo's reign was one of grandeur and expense. He built lavish residences, staged tournaments, and hosted theatrical spectacles that proclaimed his authority. This world of pageantry and art was the world into which his daughter Eleonora was born. Her mother, Eleonora de' Medici, brought to Mantua the prestige of another illustrious house. The Medici of Florence were among the most powerful families in Italy, famous for their banking wealth, political acumen, and patronage of learning. Through this union, 2 of the peninsula's most distinguished dynasties were linked. The Medici heritage provided a model of cultured rule that complemented the Gonzaga's own traditions. It also connected Mantua to Florence, Rome, and beyond, giving the young Eleonora a family network that extended across Europe. Her mother's influence was crucial, for it ensured that the Gonzaga children grew up with an appreciation not only for splendor, but also for disciplined elegance and religious devotion, values that would later shape Eleonora's conduct as empress. The Gonzaga family, like many princely houses of the time, relied on marriage alliances to preserve its position. Through careful negotiation, they tied themselves to the ruling families of Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. These alliances were not merely ceremonial. They were the instruments by which small states like Mantua survived among larger powers. The connection to the Medici strengthened the family's ties to the papacy, while their loyalty to the Habsburgs ensured protection within the imperial framework. Thus, from birth, Eleonora belonged to a network of relatives and allies that gave her both privilege and responsibility. At the turn of the 17th century, Mantua stood as a crossroads between the fading world of the Renaissance and the new age of the Baroque. The ideals of harmony, proportion, and humanist learning that had defined the 15th century were now joined by a deeper sense of drama and religious intensity inspired by the Counter-Reformation. The Gonzagas, ever attentive to change, embraced this new style with enthusiasm. Their architects designed grand churches and theaters that combined art with devotion. Music became an essential part of court life, not only as entertainment, but also as a tool for expressing faith. Sacred compositions filled the city's chapels, while secular madrigals celebrated love and heroism in the ducal palace. Life in such a court demanded constant display. The Gonzaga household was a carefully organized system of officials, servants, and artists, all serving the Duke and his family. Public ceremonies, processions, and festivals marked the rhythm of the year. Every event carried political meaning, showing Mantua's sophistication and loyalty to the Catholic cause. For the daughters of the house, including young Eleonora, these ceremonies were lessons in conduct. They learned how to present themselves in public, how to speak with grace, and how to convey dignity through silence. From an early age, Eleonora would have observed her mother and the Duchess's ladies, mastering the subtle art of courtly behavior that would later be expected of her in Vienna. Education for a Gonzaga princess was rigorous, but shaped by gender expectations. Girls were taught to read and write, often in several languages, including Italian, Latin, and sometimes Spanish or French, depending on diplomatic needs. Music and embroidery were essential accomplishments, as was the ability to dance and play instruments. Instruction in religion was central. The Jesuits, who had become influential educators across Catholic Europe, provided moral and intellectual guidance to the Gonzaga family. Their schools promoted discipline, devotion, and loyalty to the Church. It is likely that Eleonora's tutors included members of this order or those trained under its system. Through them, she absorbed the ideals of the Counter-Reformation, obedience, piety, and service to God and monarch. Her education also reflected the influence of convent life. Many noble daughters spent time in religious houses, either for formal schooling or as preparation for marriage. The convents of northern Italy were centers of female learning, music, and contemplation. Within their walls, girls were taught to pray, sing, and read devotional literature. The experience fostered habits of reflection and self-control. Even those who later married carried with them a spiritual discipline shaped by this environment. Eleonora's later correspondence and patronage show traces of this upbringing. Her support for the Poor Clares and other female religious orders suggests a lasting sympathy for the cloistered world she had known in youth. The Counter-Reformation's emphasis on Marian devotion also left its mark on her early years. The Virgin Mary was presented as the ideal model of womanly virtue, pure, obedient, and compassionate. Eleonora's religious formation would have centered on this image, encouraging her to see faith not only as belief, but as a way of living. Her later reputation for piety at the imperial court was not a sudden development, but the continuation of values instilled in Mantua. She learned that public virtue could strengthen dynastic prestige, just as much as political alliances could. Within this framework of education and faith, the Gonzaga family prepared its daughters for their most important duty, marriage. The choice of a husband for a princess like Eleonora was not a matter of personal affection, but of diplomacy. Each marriage extended the family's influence and secured its position in the intricate hierarchy of European politics. The Gonzaga's ambitions were high. They sought connections not with local Italian nobility, but with ruling dynasties of the highest rank. This ambition was both a source of strength and of risk, for it demanded costly dowries and careful negotiation. During Eleonora's childhood, discussions about her future would have been part of court conversation. Vincenzo I had several children, and each was expected to contribute to the family's network of alliances. Sons could serve as soldiers or cardinals. Daughters could be placed in convents or married into foreign courts. For Eleonora, whose beauty and intelligence were noted by observers, the prospects were bright. Her Medici blood made her a desirable match, and her family's loyalty to the Habsburgs provided a natural link to the imperial house. Even before she reached maturity, Mantua's diplomats may have explored possible unions that could strengthen ties with Vienna. Such arrangements required patience and subtlety. Negotiations for royal marriages involved envoys, letters, and sometimes years of waiting. The question of dowry alone could determine whether an alliance succeeded or failed. A dowry represented not only a financial transaction, but also the symbolic transfer of a woman's honor and the prestige of her family. The Gonzagas, who were not as wealthy as larger powers, had to balance generosity with caution. Yet they understood that marrying a daughter to a Habsburg prince would elevate their standing across Europe. While these political calculations unfolded, Eleonora continued her education and social training. She participated in religious festivals, court entertainments, and family ceremonies that displayed Mantua's grandeur. Artists and poets at the court celebrated her grace and virtue in their works, following the Renaissance custom of praising noble women as embodiments of moral and aesthetic ideals. Such representations were not purely decorative. They reinforced the family's image of cultured authority. Eleonora's exposure to this environment taught her how art and ceremony could be used to convey messages of power, a lesson she would later apply in her patronage as empress. The atmosphere of Mantua also encouraged a cosmopolitan outlook. Visitors from Spain, France, and the empire passed through the city, bringing news and fashions from abroad. Diplomatic guests attended operas and tournaments, exchanging gifts and courtesies with the Gonzaga family. From them, young Eleonora would have heard stories of distant courts and learned the protocols of international etiquette. Such experiences broadened her understanding of politics and prepared her for life beyond Italy. When the time came for her to leave Mantua and join the Habsburg world, she would do so with an awareness of the expectations and traditions that shaped European nobility. Despite the splendor of Mantua, the Gonzagas faced growing financial and political challenges. The extravagance of Vincenzo's court strained the ducal treasury, and neighboring states watched Mantua's affairs with envy. The family's dependence on alliances made them vulnerable to shifts in international politics. Yet within the walls of the ducal palace, these tensions were hidden behind displays of magnificence. For Eleonora, childhood remained a time of learning, faith, and disciplined luxury. Her world was one where beauty and duty coexisted, where every gesture carried meaning, and where the actions of a single woman could influence the reputation of an entire dynasty. As she approached adulthood, Eleonora embodied the qualities her family valued most: refinement, intelligence, and devotion. Her upbringing had given her the grace of an Italian princess and the seriousness of a woman destined for high office. The Gonzaga's hopes for her were clear. She would strengthen the family's place among Europe's great powers. The path that led her from Mantua to Vienna was already being prepared, shaped by the political vision of her father and the religious ideals of her mother. Her early life, then, was not merely a prelude but the foundation of her later role as empress. The lessons of her childhood, the union of faith and art, the balance of humility and dignity, the understanding of marriage as duty, remained with her throughout her life. In Mantua, she had witnessed how a small court could command respect through culture and devotion. In Vienna, she would apply the same principles on a grander scale. The refinement of her upbringing allowed her to navigate the complexities of the Habsburg world with confidence and poise. Thus, Eleonora Gonzaga's family background and early formation were more than personal history. They were part of the broader fabric of European politics and culture. The Gonzaga dynasty provided her with a name of distinction. The Medici connection gave her prestige, and Mantua's environment offered her a model of princely life that blended elegance with piety. From these elements emerged a woman prepared to play a significant role on the imperial stage. As she left behind the familiar surroundings of her birthplace to enter the austere grandeur of the Habsburg court, she carried with her the legacy of Mantua, the artistry, the devotion, and the diplomatic skill that would define her life as one of the most respected empresses of her time. The path that led Eleonora Gonzaga from the cultured world of Mantua to the imperial court of Vienna was shaped by both personal circumstance and political necessity. In the early 17th century, Europe was a continent bound together by dynastic interests, and few families understood this better than the Habsburgs. For them, marriage was an instrument of policy as important as war or diplomacy. When the time came for Archduke Ferdinand of Styria, soon to become Emperor Ferdinand II, to take a wife, his advisors sought a bride who could reinforce his Catholic faith, enhance his prestige, and strengthen his alliances within Italy. Among the candidates available, Eleonora Gonzaga stood out as a fitting match: noble, well-educated, and closely linked by birth to families that had long supported the imperial cause. The Habsburg interest in Italian alliances had deep roots. Italy's duchies and kingdoms were central to the balance of power that sustained imperial influence in Europe. The Spanish branch of the Habsburgs controlled large territories in the south, while the Austrian line maintained close ties with Milan and Mantua. These connections not only provided political leverage, but also served as cultural and economic bridges between Central Europe and the Mediterranean. By uniting with the Gonzagas, Ferdinand could strengthen his relationship with a house known for its loyalty and its devotion to the Catholic faith. Such a union also promised to reinforce his image as a ruler of refinement and piety, qualities that were especially important at a time when the Protestant challenge threatened to divide the Holy Roman Empire. Negotiations for the marriage began quietly, handled by diplomats and family intermediaries who understood the delicate nature of such arrangements. Mantua's envoys corresponded with representatives in Graz, where Ferdinand then resided as Archduke of Inner Austria. Letters passed through trusted clerics and court officials, outlining possible terms and discussing matters of dowry, precedence, and religious conformity. Both sides approached the match with caution but mutual interest. For the Gonzagas, marrying Eleonora to a Habsburg prince offered protection and prestige. For Ferdinand, it brought connections to the powerful Medici family through Eleonora's mother, and thus access to the cultural and financial resources of Italy. By the time the marriage contract was finalized, the match had become a symbol of Catholic solidarity. The dowry negotiations, as always, were intricate. Mantua's finances were strained by years of lavish spending under Vincenzo I, yet he understood that a generous settlement would elevate the family's standing among Europe's ruling houses. The agreed sum represented a significant commitment, underscoring both the Gonzagas' devotion to the imperial cause and their confidence in Eleonora's future. Alongside the monetary arrangements came the exchange of gifts, jewels, and titles that marked noble unions of the period. Each item had symbolic meaning, expressing continuity between two dynasties devoted to the preservation of faith and order in a divided Europe. The wedding itself was conducted with the solemnity and splendor expected of such an alliance. It was celebrated according to Catholic ritual, with elaborate processions, music, and blessings designed to display unity and devotion. Contemporary accounts describe a ceremony filled with grandeur, but also with genuine religious fervor. The marriage was not simply a family affair. It was a public statement of Catholic triumphalism in an age of conflict. For the Gonzagas, it reaffirmed their place among the champions of the Counter-Reformation. For the Habsburgs, it demonstrated their commitment to defending the faith and upholding dynastic stability. Once the formalities were completed, Eleonora began her journey from Mantua to the Austrian lands that would become her home. The journey itself was an event of great significance, both personal and political. Along the route, cities and villages celebrated her passage with feasts, music, and public prayers. These displays of hospitality were more than gestures of courtesy. They were expressions of loyalty to the imperial family and to the Catholic cause she now represented. The road from the warmth and color of northern Italy to the colder, more austere landscape of Styria marked a transition not only in geography, but in way of life. For Eleonora, this move required a remarkable degree of adaptability. The Italian court of her childhood had been lively, artistic, and expressive. It valued conversation, music, and the display of cultivated manners. The Austrian court, by contrast, emphasized restraint, hierarchy, and religious discipline. The difference reflected broader contrasts between southern and central Europe. The former steeped in Renaissance humanism, the latter in the sober spirit of reform and obedience. To thrive in Vienna, Eleonora had to balance the grace and elegance of her Italian upbringing with the piety and modesty expected of a Habsburg consort. When she arrived in her new surroundings, Eleonora was received with honor by Ferdinand's family and courtiers. Her youth, beauty, and reputation for intelligence impressed those who met her. Yet the Habsburg court was not an easy place for outsiders. Its etiquette was rigid, its politics subtle, and its factions deeply entrenched. Eleonora's arrival inevitably stirred curiosity and some resentment among courtiers who feared new influences at the center of power. Nonetheless, her composure and tact helped her gain acceptance. She understood that her first duty was to represent the dignity of her husband and to embody the ideals of an empress in waiting. Her role as Archduchess carried specific responsibilities. She was expected to maintain a household that reflected the moral and religious values of the dynasty. This meant appointing ladies of proven virtue, ensuring that her attendants observed strict discipline, and providing an example of decorum to the entire court. She also took part in public ceremonies, acting as a visible link between the imperial family and the people. Her presence at processions, masses, and charitable events reinforced the image of a devout and benevolent court, one that stood firm amid the turbulence of the age. Eleonora's early years in the Habsburg world coincided with growing tension within the empire. Ferdinand, a man of strong faith and uncompromising principles, was preparing to defend Catholicism against rising Protestant opposition. His religious conviction shaped both his personal life and his policies. For him, Eleonora's piety was not only a virtue but a necessity. She shared his belief in divine order and his devotion to the Church. Their marriage thus functioned as both partnership and symbol. She represented the spiritual grace that complemented his role as defender of the faith. In establishing her household, Eleonora drew on the lessons she had learned in Mantua. She created an environment that blended Italian refinement with Austrian sobriety. Her apartments were decorated with art and music reminiscent of her homeland, yet her daily routine followed the disciplined rhythm of prayer and duty demanded by the Habsburgs. This balance between elegance and devotion became a hallmark of her style as consort. Through her taste and generosity, she introduced new cultural influences into the Austrian court, fostering a spirit of artistic renewal that would later flourish under her stepson, Emperor Ferdinand III. Building a network of allies was another essential task for the new archduchess. Court politics required careful management of relationships with nobles, clerics, and foreign envoys. Eleonora's intelligence and discretion earned her respect. She cultivated friendships with influential figures, including members of the Jesuit order, whose guidance shaped much of her spiritual life. Her confessor, a Jesuit priest known for his learning and moderation, became one of her closest advisors. Through him, she deepened her understanding of theology and strengthened her resolve to live according to the principles of the Counter-Reformation. Faith formed the center of Eleonora's existence. Each day began and ended with prayer. Attendance at Mass was constant, and her patronage of religious institutions began soon after her arrival. She supported Jesuit colleges, funded the restoration of chapels, and encouraged the education of young women in pious instruction. Her actions were not motivated by mere formality. They reflected a genuine commitment to the spiritual mission that she and her husband believed had been entrusted to them. In her letters to family members, Eleonora often spoke of the need to combine humility with strength, devotion with prudence. The Habsburg court, deeply influenced by the Jesuits, viewed religion as both personal discipline and public duty. As Ferdinand's consort, Eleonora embodied this union. Her example was cited in sermons and moral treatises as that of a virtuous woman who combined obedience with wisdom. In a world where rulers were judged not only by their policies but by their piety, such an image carried immense weight. Her influence extended beyond the walls of the palace. Through her charitable foundations and patronage of religious orders, she reached the wider population, reinforcing loyalty to the crown and faith in the Church. At the same time, Eleonora faced the private challenges of adjusting to a new culture. The language, customs, and climate of Austria were far removed from those of her Italian home. The food was heavier, the etiquette more formal, and the winters harsher. Letters from visiting diplomats described the Viennese court as solemn and ceremonious, governed by rules that left little room for spontaneity. Yet within these constraints, Eleonora found ways to express her personality. She hosted small gatherings where music and poetry softened the severity of court life, and she encouraged Italian artists to visit and perform. Through such gestures, she created spaces of warmth and grace within the rigid hierarchy of the Habsburg world. Her relationship with Ferdinand developed gradually into one of mutual respect. Though their marriage was arranged for political reasons, they shared deep religious convictions that bound them together. Ferdinand admired her intelligence and composure, while she valued his moral seriousness and faith. Together they presented a united front, embodying the ideal of Christian rulership promoted by the Counter-Reformation. The stability of their partnership would prove vital in the turbulent years to come, as the empire faced rebellion and war. The presence of Eleonora at Ferdinand's side enhanced his authority among Catholic princes. Her Gonzaga lineage connected him to Italy's most cultured circles, while her Medici ancestry lent an aura of sophistication that appealed to European observers. She thus served as a living bridge between regions and traditions, symbolizing the unity of Catholic Europe under Habsburg leadership. This role required constant attention to appearance and behavior. Every gesture, every word, could be interpreted as political statement. Eleonora mastered the art of expressing virtue without ostentation, dignity without arrogance. Her devotion to the Jesuits also had political implications. The order's influence at the imperial court was strong, and its members played key roles in education, diplomacy, and confession. By aligning herself with them, Eleonora ensured access to a network of informed and loyal counselors. The Jesuits, in turn, regarded her as an ally in their mission to sustain Catholic orthodoxy throughout the empire. Her patronage of their institutions reinforced the spiritual unity that Ferdinand sought to impose across his realms. The years following her marriage marked a period of transition not only for Eleonora, but for Europe itself. The tension between Catholic and Protestant powers was reaching a breaking point, soon to erupt into the devastating conflict known as the 30 Years' War. Within this storm, the Habsburgs positioned themselves as the defenders of faith and tradition. Eleonora's presence at court helped to give that cause a human face. Her piety and composure offered reassurance to those who looked to the imperial family as a moral compass in uncertain times. Her household became a model of order and virtue. Servants and attendants followed a daily schedule centered on prayer, work, and charity. Eleonora supervised these routines personally, ensuring that her home reflected the discipline she demanded of herself. Visitors often remarked on the serenity and dignity of her domestic sphere, where art and religion coexisted in harmony. Paintings of saints and biblical scenes adorned the walls, while music written by Italian composers accompanied devotions. In this environment, Eleonora lived out the ideals of Catholic womanhood that her education in Mantua had instilled. Through these early years in Austria, Eleonora Gonzaga transformed from a princess of a small Italian duchy into a figure of imperial stature. She had entered a foreign land as a young bride and adapted to its customs without losing her identity. By uniting the refinement of her upbringing with the moral gravity of the Habsburg court, she created a distinctive style of queenship that would influence generations to come. Her faith anchored her through the challenges of change, while her intelligence and grace won her the respect of those around her. The journey from Mantua to Vienna thus marked more than a physical relocation. It was a passage from one world to another. In leaving behind the splendor of her father's court, Eleonora carried with her the lessons of a lifetime. That power requires restraint, that beauty serves truth, and that devotion gives meaning to authority. These convictions would guide her as she stood beside Ferdinand during the trials that awaited the empire. Her marriage had begun as a political alliance, but it became a partnership grounded in shared belief and purpose. As the new Archduchess of Austria, Eleonora Gonzaga entered history not only as a consort, but as a woman whose faith and intellect would help shape the destiny of the Habsburg world. When Ferdinand became emperor, the empire stood on the edge of disaster. The Bohemian Revolt, which had begun as a challenge to Habsburg rule, had grown into a wider conflict that threatened to tear the empire apart. The coronation of Ferdinand and Eleonora did not occur in a time of peace and celebration, but in an atmosphere of anxiety, where the loyalty of princes and subjects could not be taken for granted. Yet this moment was carefully shaped to project confidence and divine order. The Habsburgs understood that ceremony could strengthen authority, and Eleonora's coronation as empress carried heavy symbolic weight. She was presented as the spiritual partner of the emperor, chosen by God to help restore unity and faith in a divided Christendom. The rituals that surrounded her enthronement echoed those of medieval queenship, but were infused with the moral seriousness of the Counter-Reformation. Her garments, gestures, and public prayers all served to convey the message that the imperial couple ruled not merely by birthright, but by divine mandate. The coronation in Vienna was marked by solemn processions, masses, and public blessings. Clergy and courtiers joined in ceremonies that underscored the alliance between throne and altar. The Jesuits, whose influence on both Ferdinand and Eleonora was profound, designed parts of the liturgy to highlight her piety and humility. She was seen kneeling for long periods in prayer, her crown removed in reverence, her face calm but resolute. The people who gathered to watch her coronation saw in her not only a queen, but a model of Christian womanhood. Her image as a devout and obedient empress complemented Ferdinand's stern reputation as a ruler chosen to defend the Catholic faith. Together, they appeared as the moral center of an empire struggling to find stability in chaos. From the beginning of their joint reign, Ferdinand and Eleonora were portrayed as a sacred pair. Artists and poets at the imperial court created works that depicted them as defenders of the faith and guardians of divine order. Medals, engravings, and frescoes circulated throughout the empire, showing the emperor with sword and cross, and the empress with rosary and open book. In these images, she symbolized mercy and intercession, while he embodied justice and strength. This visual partnership helped shape the political identity of the dynasty. In a time when armies clashed over questions of religion, the imperial couple offered a vision of Catholic unity supported by grace and discipline. The court in Vienna became the chief stage for this religious and political theater. The Jesuits, who had long served as the intellectual arm of the Counter-Reformation, found in Eleonora a devoted patron. She supported their colleges, schools, and theaters, which became centers of cultural and moral instruction. The Jesuit theater, in particular, played a crucial role in promoting the imperial message. Plays and pageants dramatized the triumph of faith over heresy, the victory of virtue over temptation, and the reward of obedience to divine authority. Eleonora often attended these performances, seated beside Ferdinand in public view. Her presence reminded audiences that the empire's strength rested as much on prayer and devotion as on armies and treaties. Under her guidance, Vienna took on a new spiritual character. Churches rose in honor of the Virgin and the saints, religious confraternities flourished, and sacred music filled the chapels and courtyards of the palace. Eleonora's sponsorship extended beyond building and ceremony. She actively supported the education of young women in convent schools, believing that moral instruction was the foundation of a stable society. Her gifts to nunneries, hospitals, and orphanages showed her concern for the poor and displaced, many of whom had been driven to Vienna by the violence of the war. Through such acts of charity, she reinforced the image of the imperial household as a refuge of compassion amid turmoil. Despite the public grandeur that surrounded her, Eleonora's role during the 30 Years' War was neither passive nor confined to the ceremonial sphere. Behind the scenes, she exercised influence in ways that were subtle but real. Diplomats who visited the court often sought her intercession when political negotiations stalled. Her reputation for fairness and discretion made her a trusted mediator in disputes among Catholic princes and foreign envoys. She received letters from widowed queens, abbesses, and displaced noblewomen, asking for assistance or recommendation. Many of these appeals were answered, showing that her compassion was matched by a keen understanding of power. Within the imperial household, her influence extended to appointments and favors. Those seeking advancement often approached her through her confessor or chamberlain, knowing that a word from the empress could ease access to the emperor. Yet Eleonora was careful not to overstep the boundaries of propriety. She understood that a woman's political power at court depended on restraint and timing. Her interventions were always framed as acts of charity or concern for the faith, rather than assertions of personal authority. This delicate balance allowed her to play a meaningful role in governance without provoking resentment among the emperor's ministers. Her involvement in informal diplomacy also reflected her sense of duty toward the broader Catholic world. The war had displaced many noble families, particularly those from Bohemia and the German states who remained loyal to the emperor. Eleonora provided shelter for several of these exiles, arranging housing in Vienna and financial aid through her charitable foundations. Among them were widows and orphans of fallen soldiers, scholars who had lost their patronage, and members of religious orders expelled from Protestant territories. In helping them, she demonstrated that the imperial court was not only the center of military command, but also a sanctuary for the faithful. As the war dragged on, Eleonora used her patronage to sustain the arts even when resources were scarce. Music was one of her most cherished interests. She commissioned masses, motets, and oratorios that celebrated divine protection over the empire. Some of these works were performed in private chapels. Others marked public occasions such as victories or peace negotiations. Composers from Italy and the German lands found employment in her service, keeping alive a tradition of sacred art that might otherwise have withered amid war's austerity. Painters, too, benefited from her protection. Portraits of saints and religious allegories continued to adorn the palace walls, offering visual consolation in a time of uncertainty. Eleonora's patronage also had a political dimension. By employing artists and musicians from different parts of the empire, she fostered a sense of unity across regions divided by conflict. Her court became a small reflection of the empire's diversity, where Italian, German, and Spanish influences blended harmoniously. Visitors remarked on the contrast between the destruction that marked so much of Europe and the serenity that prevailed in her household. It was as if, within the walls of the imperial palace, the order and beauty of the old world had been preserved against the tide of chaos. Despite her devotion to duty, Eleonora faced personal sorrow. She bore no children with Ferdinand, a fact that might have caused anxiety in another court. Yet the emperor already had sons from his first marriage, and this eased the pressure on her. She accepted her childlessness with humility, regarding it as part of God's plan. Her letters reveal no bitterness, only a quiet acceptance and a deepening of spiritual focus. In the absence of her own offspring, she formed close bonds with her stepchildren, especially the future Ferdinand III. Their relationship was based on mutual respect and affection. She encouraged his interest in music and learning, and he later credited her with shaping his taste for art and his understanding of the responsibilities of rule. Her health, however, began to show signs of strain. The demands of court life, constant public appearances, and the emotional toll of the war weighed heavily on her. Physicians advised rest, but she continued her devotions and duties with unflagging discipline. Her confessors, most of them Jesuits, became her spiritual anchors. They guided her through periods of fatigue and melancholy, urging her to find strength in prayer and charity. Her spiritual writings from this time, though few, suggest a woman who viewed suffering as a path to purification. She believed that her own endurance mirrored that of the empire, both tested but sustained by faith. The war brought hardship even to the splendor of the imperial court. Refugees flooded Vienna, and the city's resources were stretched to the limit. Inflation, disease, and shortages forced the court to adopt austerity measures. Yet Eleonora insisted that the dignity of the empire should never appear diminished. Ceremonies continued, though with simpler decorations. Music was performed, though on a smaller scale. She believed that ritual and beauty had the power to lift spirits and remind people of divine providence. Her example inspired courtiers to maintain discipline and composure even in adversity. Through these years of conflict, Eleonora's composure became a source of stability. While generals and ministers argued over strategy, she embodied continuity and moral purpose. Visitors to the court described her as calm and resolute, her demeanor unchanged by victory or defeat. Her piety was genuine, but it was also practical. It helped hold the court together when fear and fatigue threatened to unravel it. In her private chapel, she prayed for peace, not as an abstraction, but as the only condition under which faith and culture could flourish again. The propaganda of the time often depicted her as a second Esther or Judith, a woman whose virtue protected the people from disaster. Such comparisons were not accidental. They reinforced the idea that the imperial family's authority rested on divine favor, manifested through the purity of its female members. Paintings showed her interceding for the empire, surrounded by angels and symbols of victory. These images circulated widely, shaping public perception and offering a comforting vision of stability in a fractured world. In this sense, Eleonora's image became part of the empire's spiritual arsenal, no less important than armies or treaties. Her influence on architecture was another expression of faith and policy. She sponsored chapels within the Habsburg Palace and encouraged the construction of new churches in Vienna dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Each project carried both devotional and political meaning. The churches were visible signs of Catholic renewal, while their beauty reminded subjects of the empire's enduring glory. Architects from Italy brought new styles to the city, blending Baroque exuberance with Habsburg solemnity. Under her patronage, Vienna began to take on the form that would later define it as a city of imperial grandeur. As the conflict entered its later stages, Eleonora's household became a symbol of constancy amid exhaustion. The empire's finances were depleted, and morale was low, yet she continued to support hospitals and convents. She sold personal jewelry to fund relief for war victims and arranged the distribution of food to families displaced by battle. Her actions were rarely publicized, but they were widely known. Even those who opposed Habsburg policies respected her sincerity. In the correspondence of foreign envoys, she appears as a figure of compassion who softened the harshness of imperial power. The relationship between Eleonora and Ferdinand deepened as the years went by. Both aged under the weight of war, yet their shared faith drew them closer. They spent long hours together in prayer, discussing matters of conscience and policy. Ferdinand valued her judgment, particularly in questions involving religious orders and charitable foundations. When disagreements arose within the court, she often acted as a calming influence, urging moderation and forgiveness. In her presence, even hardened soldiers and bureaucrats seemed to soften, recognizing that the empress represented a higher ideal than mere politics. By the time peace negotiations began to appear on the horizon, Eleonora's health had grown fragile, but her spirit remained strong. She had spent nearly 2 decades in a world of conflict and uncertainty, yet she never abandoned the conviction that divine providence guided human affairs. Her life during the war illustrated the union of faith and responsibility that defined Habsburg rule. She was not a passive observer of events, but an active participant in the moral and cultural resistance to chaos. Her influence reached beyond the palace, shaping the tone of an entire era. When viewed in retrospect, Eleonora's role during the 30 Years' War was both intimate and monumental. She did not command armies or draft decrees, yet her presence lent the empire a sense of moral coherence. Through prayer, patronage, and quiet diplomacy, she helped sustain a vision of order that outlasted the conflict itself. The institutions she supported, the artists she protected, and the ideals she embodied all contributed to the renewal of Catholic Europe. Even in hardship, she demonstrated that leadership could be expressed through faith, compassion, and endurance rather than conquest. Her queenship during the war thus marked the culmination of her transformation from an Italian duchess into an imperial figure. She had left Mantua as a young bride and entered a realm consumed by turmoil. By the time the war neared its end, she stood as one of the defining symbols of Habsburg perseverance. Through her, the idea of an empire sanctified by devotion took tangible form. In the quiet strength of her demeanor, contemporaries found reassurance that, despite suffering, the moral order of the world remained intact. And when the guns finally fell silent, it was her image, calm, prayerful, and unbroken, that lingered in the memory of a weary empire. When Ferdinand II died, Eleonora Gonzaga faced the greatest change of her life. The man with whom she had shared faith, duty, and nearly 2 decades of rule was gone, and the empire entered another uncertain period. His funeral in Vienna was one of the most solemn spectacles the city had ever seen. The court draped itself in black, churches held masses of requiem, and throughout the empire bells tolled in mourning. The ceremonies were elaborate not only as tribute to a sovereign, but also as reassurance to a shaken people that divine order still prevailed. Eleonora's composure during the long rites impressed all who witnessed them. Dressed in deep mourning, she prayed before the coffin with the same dignity that had marked her life as empress. The Jesuits, who guided the spiritual dimension of the ceremony, used the event to emphasize Ferdinand's image as a Christian ruler whose soul had ascended to eternal peace. Beside that image stood Eleonora, the living embodiment of faith and endurance. With Ferdinand's passing, she became the Dowager Empress, a title that carried prestige but also required careful navigation within the new political landscape. Her stepson, Ferdinand III, now assumed the throne. Their relationship was founded on mutual affection and respect, yet both understood the delicate balance that had to be maintained. The new emperor sought to honor his father's widow while asserting his own authority. Eleonora, for her part, avoided any appearance of interference in governance. Her wisdom lay in restraint. She knew that her influence would remain strong if she exercised it quietly. She moved between Vienna and Graz, residing often in palaces that had become associated with her personal household rather than the central court. From there, she continued her charitable works and maintained correspondence with her extended family in Italy. Despite the formal boundaries between them, the bond between Eleonora and Ferdinand III was genuine. He regarded her not merely as a stepmother, but as a counselor and moral example. During the early years of his reign, she often cared for his children, ensuring their education included both piety and learning. Her role in shaping the next generation of Habsburgs was subtle but lasting. She instilled in them a sense of responsibility, grounded in faith rather than ambition. The Empress's apartments became a place of reflection and instruction, where the younger members of the imperial family could learn the values that had sustained the dynasty through years of turmoil. She preserved the memory of Ferdinand II with care, collecting documents, portraits, and relics that would later help historians reconstruct his reign. In doing so, she acted as both guardian of family legacy and custodian of imperial identity. Widowhood freed Eleonora from the constant demands of court ceremony, but it did not lessen her devotion to religious and charitable pursuits. In many ways, her spiritual life deepened during these years. She devoted large portions of her income to founding and endowing convents, churches, and hospitals. Among her favored orders were the Poor Clares and the Discalced Carmelites, both known for their austerity and contemplation. Eleonora saw in them a reflection of her own ideals of humility and discipline. She also supported reforms within female monastic communities, encouraging stricter observance and improved education for nuns. Through these efforts, she sought to strengthen the moral fabric of Catholic society from within, ensuring that faith remained a living force rather than a mere formality. Her donations were often accompanied by personal visits to the institutions she supported. When health allowed, she attended the dedication of new chapels and the profession of young novices. Her presence inspired admiration and gratitude among the clergy and the poor alike. In her letters, she wrote of finding peace in serving others and of the comfort she took from daily acts of charity. Her will, drawn up in careful detail, reflected these priorities. It listed numerous endowments for religious foundations and provisions for the education of orphan girls. She regarded these gestures as extensions of her duty as a Christian ruler, continuing the mission she had shared with her late husband. The Jesuits continued to guide her spiritually, and her correspondence with their leaders reveals a mind still active, probing theological questions and seeking assurance that her works would bring glory to God rather than vanity to herself. Even as she turned inward to faith, Eleonora remained a force in the cultural life of the empire. Her patronage of music, which had begun during her husband's reign, continued with remarkable vitality. She became one of the chief supporters of composers who would shape the early Baroque style in Central Europe. Antonio Bertolli, who served as court composer, owed much to her encouragement. His sacred works often carried dedications to the Dowager Empress, whose taste for solemn yet expressive music guided much of Vienna's artistic output in those years. Johann Heinrich Schmelzer, another figure associated with her circle, developed instrumental forms that would later influence European music as a whole. Eleonora's salons and private concerts provided both refuge and opportunity for these artists, allowing them to create beauty in a time still marked by the scars of war. Her influence extended beyond music. She maintained correspondence with Italian painters, poets, and architects, sustaining the cultural bridge that had long connected Vienna and Mantua. Through these exchanges, she kept alive her ties to the world of her youth and ensured that the Habsburg court retained its connection to Italian art. Her letters to family members in Mantua reveal nostalgia, tempered by practicality. She lamented the decline of her native duchy, especially during the War of the Mantuan Succession, yet she never ceased to support its surviving members. When possible, she intervened to secure pensions or honors for relatives and retainers who had lost fortunes in the conflict. Her position at the imperial court gave her leverage, and she used it discreetly to maintain Gonzaga prestige even as the family's power waned. Eleonora's diplomatic instincts remained sharp. She understood that the network of dynastic alliances connecting Europe's royal houses was both fragile and essential. Through correspondence and intermediaries, she continued to act as an informal link between the Habsburgs and the Italian principalities. Her advice was sought in matters concerning Mantua, Modena, and Tuscany. The letters she exchanged with her brother and nephews show her awareness of the shifting balance of power that followed the peace settlements of mid-century. Though she had withdrawn from active politics, her judgment was respected by diplomats who valued her experience and discretion. She believed that the true art of rule lay in patience, and that the wounds of war could only be healed through faith and steady governance. In Vienna, her presence was felt not through decrees or commands, but through example. Visitors to her residence described a household marked by order, devotion, and quiet refinement. She rose early for prayer, attended Mass daily, and spent much of the afternoon in reading or in correspondence. Music and scripture formed the rhythm of her days. Evenings were often devoted to charitable audiences, where she received petitioners seeking aid. Her demeanor remained calm and dignified, free from ostentation. Although she had once been surrounded by the splendor of the imperial court, her later years were characterized by simplicity. The grandeur of her surroundings served as a frame for humility, not pride. Her connection to Ferdinand III remained affectionate throughout his reign. He often sought her counsel on family matters and paid her visits that blended duty with genuine warmth. She, in turn, encouraged his efforts to restore peace and rebuild the empire's strength after decades of conflict. Her confidence in him never wavered, and she prayed daily for his success. When his own children came of age, she took pleasure in seeing the continuity of the dynasty she had helped to sustain. Though she no longer played a public role, her name retained an aura of sanctity. Preachers in Vienna sometimes cited her as a model of virtuous widowhood, comparing her composure to that of biblical heroines who combined sorrow with steadfast faith. Her devotion to the poor Clares grew stronger with age. The simplicity of their lives appealed to her as she withdrew further from the formalities of court. She funded the expansion of their convents and arranged for masses to be said in perpetuity for the souls of her husband and family. These acts were not only expressions of personal piety, but also affirmations of continuity between her private faith and the public identity she had once embodied as empress. In the quiet of these convents, she found the peace that had eluded Europe for much of her lifetime. Her writings from this period, including fragments of prayer and meditation preserved by her confessors, show a woman at ease with mortality and confident in divine mercy. The cultural scene of Vienna in the 1640s and 50s bore her unmistakable imprint. She continued to commission sacred compositions for feast days and anniversaries, insisting that the splendor of worship should reflect the glory of God. Even in an era of financial constraint, she found ways to support musicians and painters. The chapels she endowed became centers of creative activity, where the arts served faith rather than vanity. Through these acts, she helped shape the development of the Viennese Baroque, linking artistic excellence with spiritual depth. Her support of theater, particularly the Jesuit plays that combined moral instruction with spectacle, reflected her lifelong belief in the power of beauty to elevate the soul. In correspondence with Italian artists, she expressed both pride and humility. She praised their work for its ability to draw the heart toward contemplation, but cautioned them against excess. Her taste leaned toward balance and harmony, qualities that mirrored her own temperament. She encouraged themes of redemption and grace, insisting that art should reflect the possibility of renewal after suffering. This vision, shaped by her experience of war and loss, lent her patronage a unique tone of serenity. Artists who served her often spoke of her as a gentle mentor rather than a distant patron. Her attention to family affairs remained constant. The decline of Mantua, once a shining center of art and learning, pained her deeply. The War of the Mantuan Succession had left the duchy weakened and divided, its treasures scattered, and its autonomy diminished. Through her letters, Eleonora sought to preserve what could be saved: archives, artworks, and family traditions. She maintained communication with surviving Gonzagas, offering comfort and practical help. Her efforts to keep the connection between Mantua and Vienna alive reflected her understanding that family bonds transcended political shifts. To her, lineage carried not only privilege but responsibility. In supporting her relatives, she honored the memory of her parents and the culture that had formed her. As age advanced, Eleonora's health grew frail, and she gradually retreated from public life. The death of friends and contemporaries reminded her that her own time was drawing near. She arranged her affairs with the same order and foresight that had guided her life. Her correspondence became shorter but no less thoughtful. She continued to receive visitors, often clerics or members of religious orders seeking guidance. Her conversation was marked by gentleness and clarity. She spoke of gratitude rather than regret, viewing her years as a gift. The empire she had helped to steady was now at peace, and she felt her duty fulfilled. In her final years, Eleonora chose to live in increasing seclusion. Her residence in Vienna became more a convent than a palace. She spent long hours in prayer, attended by a small household devoted to simplicity and devotion. Visitors noted that her surroundings were modest, her clothing plain, and her speech filled with kindness. The same discipline that had once allowed her to govern her court now sustained her in solitude. She continued to support charitable causes, directing funds to hospitals and schools. Her last letters to her family in Italy expressed both affection and resignation. She asked for prayers, not praise, and urged her nieces to live lives of humility and service. When she died in Vienna in the year 1655, the city mourned her with reverence. Her funeral was less grand than her husband's, but no less heartfelt. Clergy, courtiers, and citizens attended, recognizing in her passing the end of an era that had shaped the spiritual and cultural identity of the empire. She was buried in the Capuchin crypt beside Ferdinand II, fulfilling her wish to rest near him in death as she had stood beside him in life. The simplicity of her tomb contrasted with the opulence of many imperial monuments, reflecting the humility that had defined her later years. The reaction to her death was immediate and sincere. Sermons across the empire praised her virtue, charity, and steadfast faith. Jesuit writers described her as a model of Christian widowhood, emphasizing her quiet strength and unwavering devotion. Poets composed elegies that celebrated her as the soul of an age that had endured suffering yet emerged purified. In Vienna, the institutions she had founded continued to bear her mark. The convents she endowed prayed daily for her soul, and musicians she had supported dedicated new works in her memory. Her influence lived on in the moral and artistic life of the court, where her example set a standard for future generations of Habsburg consorts. In the broader history of the dynasty, Eleonora Gonzaga's widowhood stands as a testament to the enduring power of faith and intellect. She had entered the Habsburg world as a foreign princess and left it as one of its guiding figures. Her life bridged two cultures and two centuries, embodying the transition from the Renaissance ideals of her youth to the Baroque spirituality of her maturity. Through her, the union of Italian grace and Austrian devotion found lasting expression. Her years as Dowager Empress revealed the depth of her character. Disciplined yet compassionate, contemplative yet active, humble yet commanding in presence. She transformed widowhood into a form of service, proving that influence need not depend on office or command. By the time her contemporaries looked back on her life, they saw not only a queen but a moral exemplar. Her legacy endured in the churches she built, the music she inspired, and the lives she touched through charity. More importantly, it endured in the memory of an empire that had survived its greatest trial and found in her a symbol of hope. Eleonora Gonzaga's death closed the final chapter of a life spent in devotion to God and duty, yet her example continued to shape the conscience of the Habsburg court long after the candles of her funeral had burned out. The world that Eleonora Gonzaga helped shape did not end with her death. The Habsburg monarchy, which had weathered the storms of war and faith during her lifetime, was entering a new phase. Ferdinand III's reign marked the slow recovery of an empire exhausted by decades of conflict. Under his guidance, and later that of his son Leopold I, the Habsburgs began to rebuild both their political structures and their image as defenders of a redefined Catholic Europe. The court that Eleonora had known, deeply spiritual, ceremonious, and yet scarred by war, gradually transformed into a center of administrative reform and artistic flourishing. The continuity between her generation and the next was visible not only in the endurance of dynastic traditions, but also in the persistence of values she had embodied: discipline, faith, and the subtle exercise of influence through moral authority rather than direct command. After Ferdinand II's passing, the empire's priorities began to shift. His rigid confessional policies softened under Ferdinand III, who understood that recovery required compromise and careful diplomacy. While the scars of the 30 Years' War remained visible across the German lands, Vienna began to emerge as the stable heart of a redefined monarchy. The lessons learned from devastation guided a more pragmatic approach to governance. Eleonora's example, both as consort and as widow, provided a model for restraint and unity in an age when division had nearly destroyed Europe. Her moral presence lingered in the court's collective memory, influencing the tone of leadership even after her death. The Jesuits, who had once stood as militant defenders of orthodoxy, now became partners in education and administration, shaping a generation of imperial officials trained in both faith and prudence. The transition from Ferdinand III to Leopold I further consolidated these developments. The empire grew less dependent on the Spanish Habsburgs and more focused on its Central European base. Administrative reforms aimed to strengthen Austria's internal cohesion, linking Bohemia, Hungary, and the hereditary lands under a clearer structure. Vienna's bureaucracy expanded, as did the sophistication of its diplomatic corps. In this evolving world, women of the court continued to play an important role, one often unrecorded in official documents but deeply felt in practice. The example of Eleonora Gonzaga remained an enduring standard. Her image as a devout and intelligent consort, loyal yet independent-minded, set expectations for the imperial women who followed. In this environment, figures such as Maria Anna of Spain, the first wife of Ferdinand III, and Maria Leopoldine of Austria, who married him later, carried forward aspects of Eleonora's legacy. Each brought her own national and cultural heritage to the Habsburg court, blending Spanish ceremony or Tyrolean piety with the Viennese tradition Eleonora had refined. Maria Anna, a Spanish infanta accustomed to the rigid decorum of Madrid, found in Eleonora's surviving household an example of how grace and authority could coexist without harshness. Her devotion to religious ceremony echoed Eleonora's influence, though expressed through the more austere Spanish style. Maria Leopoldine, on the other hand, represented a younger generation shaped by the lessons of the 30 Years' War. Her brief marriage to Ferdinand III carried the promise of renewal that Eleonora had long prayed for. Comparisons between Eleonora and her predecessors and successors reveal how the Habsburg model of female influence evolved. Anna of Tyrol, who had been empress earlier in the century, shared Eleonora's love of piety and patronage, but lived in a period when the Counter-Reformation still demanded militancy. Eleonora's time, by contrast, saw a more reflective expression of faith, one that sought to heal rather than conquer. Where Anna had helped establish the imperial crypt and define the sacred geography of Habsburg Vienna, Eleonora deepened the emotional and artistic vocabulary of devotion. She demonstrated that an empress could be both public in duty and inwardly contemplative, bridging the divide between ruler and believer. Later women of the court looked to her as a model of how to command respect without overtly seeking power. The 17th-century Habsburg court was, in many ways, a theater of influence. Formal authority belonged to men, yet the subtle channels of persuasion, taste, and mediation often flowed through women. Eleonora understood this better than most. Her patronage of the arts, her religious foundations, and her correspondence with nobles and clerics gave her a reach that no office could define. In the decades after her death, the structure she helped shape remained central to imperial life. The presence of Italian noblewomen at court reinforced this dynamic. Many came as brides, attendants, or musicians, carrying with them the refinement of Italian culture and its deeply ingrained sense of decorum. The Habsburgs valued these women not only for their lineage, but also for their role in maintaining cultural connections with the Italian peninsula. The Italian presence in Vienna was one of Eleonora's lasting contributions. She had grown up in Mantua, a duchy where art and learning flourished under Gonzaga patronage. Her upbringing in such an environment left an indelible mark on her sense of aesthetics and manners. Through her influence, Vienna absorbed elements of Italian taste that transformed its cultural life. This connection persisted long after her death. In the mid-17th century, Florentine and Neapolitan women joined the Habsburg orbit, often bringing artists, musicians, and craftsmen in their retinues. They reinforced a tradition of elegance and artistic sophistication that distinguished the Austrian court from its northern counterparts. Mantuan musicians found refuge and employment in Vienna, continuing the artistic migration that Eleonora had encouraged. The exchange was not one-sided. Austrian and Bohemian craftsmen learned from Italian architects and painters, blending southern grace with northern solidity. The result was the distinctive style of the Viennese Baroque, a synthesis that reflected both cultural adaptation and political ambition. This aesthetic evolution mirrored the broader transformation of the Habsburg monarchy, from a defensive, war-torn power into a self-confident dynasty intent on projecting stability and grandeur. The roots of that transformation reached back to Eleonora's patronage, which had introduced the language of sacred theater, opera, and visual piety to the imperial capital. The architecture of Vienna bore visible traces of this influence. Churches commissioned during and after Eleonora's lifetime often followed models that had originated in northern Italy. Domes, chapels, and altarpieces combined dramatic structure with emotional intensity. The Jesuit Church of Vienna, which had been a focal point of Eleonora's spiritual world, became a prototype for later Baroque sanctuaries. The emphasis on divine glory expressed through art was not merely aesthetic, it served political ends as well. By aligning beauty with faith, the Habsburgs presented themselves as protectors of Catholic civilization. Eleonora's taste helped refine this message, ensuring that grandeur never drifted into vulgarity. Her influence shaped the balance between restraint and splendor that characterized Viennese art for generations. The development of court theater followed a similar trajectory. Under Eleonora, the court had hosted performances that combined music, allegory, and moral instruction. These productions, often staged by Jesuit dramatists, celebrated virtue and divine order while subtly reinforcing imperial legitimacy. After her death, this tradition continued to evolve. The spectacles of Leopold I's court drew directly from the models she had established. Operas and ballets became instruments of diplomacy as well as entertainment. They displayed not only artistic skill, but also the unity of a court governed by divine right. In every curtain, costume, and chorus, one could still trace the moral sensibility that Eleonora had promoted, that beauty should elevate the mind toward faith and duty. Her impact on music was particularly enduring. The composers she had supported formed the foundation of Vienna's musical identity. Antonio Bertali's successors in the imperial chapel continued to develop the fusion of Italian melody and German structure that would later define the city's classical heritage. The careful blending of sacred and secular elements, which had characterized Eleonora's patronage, persisted as a hallmark of Viennese taste. Music remained central to imperial ceremony, binding the court in shared emotion and ritual. In this way, her influence extended far beyond her own time, shaping the cultural language through which the Habsburgs expressed their power. Yet Eleonora's legacy was not limited to art or ceremony. It also lay in the evolving conception of religion and politics in the Habsburg world. The Counter-Reformation, which had defined the early years of her marriage, gave way to a more balanced understanding of faith's role in governance. The Jesuits continued to occupy a prominent position in imperial policy, but their mission had changed. No longer solely militant defenders of doctrine, they became educators, confessors, and advisors who infused the bureaucracy with moral purpose. Eleonora's long association with the order had helped temper its influence, channeling it toward compassion rather than rigidity. Her example demonstrated that spiritual authority could coexist with tolerance, provided it rested on sincerity and humility. The piety she embodied became part of Habsburg identity. Later empresses and archduchesses consciously followed her model, cultivating reputations for charity and moral steadfastness. Religious devotion remained a key element of imperial legitimacy, but it was now expressed through personal example as much as through policy. The public saw in these women the living reflection of divine favor, while the court regarded them as moral anchors in a world of shifting alliances. This fusion of personal sanctity and dynastic duty traced its lineage directly to Eleonora Gonzaga. She had shown that an empress could guide her court not by decree but by conscience, and that faith could serve as both comfort and instrument of statecraft. The balance between religion and politics remained delicate. The empire continued to face external threats, from the Ottoman frontier and from rival powers in France and Sweden, but its internal cohesion rested increasingly on the credibility of its rulers. The image of the Habsburgs as chosen defenders of the faith gave moral justification to their ambitions. Eleonora's life, steeped in prayer and charity, lent authenticity to this image. Her correspondence with Jesuit leaders often touched on the theme of responsibility, that those born to rule must see themselves as servants of God's will. This conviction became a quiet creed for the dynasty. It informed the education of princes and princesses, shaped court ritual, and even influenced diplomatic style. At the same time, her Italian sensibility helped moderate the stern formality of Spanish Habsburg influence. She had brought to Vienna a gentler, more human approach to devotion, one that valued emotion and beauty as expressions of faith. This perspective softened the tone of imperial religion, making it more accessible to subjects who had endured decades of dogmatic strife. The churches and convents she supported became centers of consolation and healing rather than instruments of control. In this transformation, one can see the evolution of Catholic spirituality from militant reform to pastoral care, an evolution mirrored in the broader European context of the 17th century. The cross-cultural exchange that Eleonora initiated also had diplomatic implications. Her correspondence with Italian courts fostered a network of trust that outlived her. The Gonzagas of Mantua, the Medicis of Florence, and the Bourbons of Parma all maintained channels of communication with Vienna, many of them rooted in personal ties she had established. Through these networks, the Habsburgs could influence Italian affairs without direct intervention. The marriages arranged between Austrian archduchesses and Italian princes throughout the later 17th century continued this tradition, reinforcing the dynastic web that Eleonora had helped weave. Her influence can also be traced in the way the Habsburg court adopted a more cosmopolitan outlook. The Vienna of Leopold I, though deeply Austrian in administration, remained culturally Italianate in spirit. Architects like Carlo Carlone and artists such as Andrea Pozzo carried forward the aesthetic vocabulary that had first taken root under Eleonora's guidance. Their grand frescoes and dynamic compositions turned imperial buildings into visual sermons, proclaiming divine order through art. Each brushstroke echoed the ideals she had cherished: harmony, devotion, and purpose. In many respects, Eleonora Gonzaga represented a bridge between two worlds, the Renaissance ideal of cultured virtue and the Baroque vision of disciplined grandeur. Her legacy in the Habsburg monarchy lay in merging these traditions into a single moral and artistic language. The generations that followed inherited a court where faith and culture were inseparable, where every act of patronage carried spiritual weight. The imperial family's continued support for music, architecture, and education reflected not only policy but also personal conviction, shaped by her example. Her life and its echoes remind us that the transformation of empires often depends on the quiet labor of individuals who rarely seek recognition. Eleonora's influence on administration, culture, and religion operated through persuasion rather than command. She turned personal virtue into political strength and private faith into public inspiration. When later chroniclers described the pious atmosphere of the Habsburg court, they were in truth describing the world she had built. The restraint of its ceremonies, the elegance of its architecture, and the compassion of its charities all bore her invisible signature. By the time Leopold I ascended the throne, the Habsburg monarchy had entered a new era of confidence. The empire's institutions were stronger, its capital more magnificent, and its faith more introspective. Yet beneath these visible changes lay the moral foundation laid by Eleonora Gonzaga. Her generation had endured crisis and loss, but from that endurance emerged a vision of governance rooted in conscience and culture. The empress who had once crossed the Alps from Mantua to Vienna left behind not only monuments and music, but a living philosophy of rule. Her story illustrates how power can be humanized through faith and art, and how the legacy of one life can shape the identity of a dynasty. The broader world that she inhabited and influenced continued to carry her imprint long after she was gone. In every chapel that echoed with sacred music, in every court ceremony guided by dignity rather than excess, and in every act of compassion performed in the name of the Habsburg crown, Eleonora Gonzaga's presence remained. She had turned devotion into policy, culture into unity, and grace into a form of governance. In that transformation lay her enduring gift to the empire and to the Europe that followed. After Eleonora Gonzaga's death, her name did not fade into silence. The court that had mourned her passing continued to invoke her image as a symbol of devotion, dignity, and the serene strength that defined the best of Habsburg rule. In the years that followed her burial in the Capuchin crypt beside Ferdinand II, chroniclers, preachers, and artists alike began to construct her posthumous reputation. They saw in her a reflection of the empire's endurance, a figure whose calm faith had steadied the monarchy through its most turbulent age. The imperial chronicles of the mid-17th century often mentioned her alongside the great Catholic rulers of the era, describing her as a moral compass for the dynasty. Her virtues, charity, modesty, and piety, were woven into the collective identity of the Habsburgs, presented as examples for future generations of queens and consorts to follow. In the immediate aftermath of her death, court poets and clerics composed tributes that captured both grief and admiration. Funerary sermons praised her as a woman who had turned sorrow into strength and privilege into service. Jesuit preachers in Vienna used her life as a lesson in humility for the powerful, reminding listeners that true nobility lay not in titles but in virtue. These orations were printed and circulated widely, reinforcing her image as a model of sanctified widowhood. At the same time, artists continued to depict her likeness, ensuring that her physical image remained part of imperial memory. Portraits of Eleonora, often commissioned posthumously, presented her in austere yet regal poses, dressed in dark garments and framed by symbols of faith. The most famous among these were painted by Justus Sustermans, whose work captured both her noble composure and the introspective calm that had defined her later years. Successive generations of Habsburg women found inspiration in Eleonora's example. Empresses who followed her, whether by birth or by marriage, looked to her as a standard for conduct and patronage. Her approach to queenship had balanced ceremonial grandeur with genuine religious commitment. This balance proved enduring, influencing Maria Anna of Spain, Eleonora of Mantua-Nevers, and even the later Maria Theresa, whose reign much later would combine maternal authority with devotion to faith. The religious institutions that Eleonora had founded or supported remained active throughout the century, their chapels adorned with memorials to her beneficence. The convents of the Poor Clares and the Discalced Carmelites in Vienna prayed for her soul long after the immediate mourning had passed. Each anniversary of her death became an occasion for solemn remembrance, with masses dedicated to her memory and music performed in her honor by the same court chapel she had helped nurture. Her influence in the realm of art and music also persisted. Composers continued to dedicate works to her, even after her passing, as a gesture of gratitude and respect. The tradition of sacred compositions she had championed evolved into a hallmark of Viennese culture, blending Italian melody with Austrian solemnity. The architectural projects she had sponsored, particularly the chapels and convents, became part of the city's religious landscape, linking her name permanently to the spiritual geography of Vienna. Artists and architects who worked under her patronage often trained pupils who would carry forward her aesthetic ideals. In this way, her taste shaped the artistic vocabulary of Central Europe well into the next century. The literary world also preserved her memory. Poets of the late 17th century described her as an embodiment of the virtues that defined ideal womanhood. In their verses, she was portrayed as both queen and saint, a rare figure who combined the grace of a Renaissance lady with the moral strength of a Counter-Reformation matron. Her life inspired several devotional biographies written by clerics who sought to provide examples of Christian conduct for women of rank. These works emphasized her humility, her intellectual curiosity, and her unshakable faith. Though often idealized, they reveal how deeply her character had impressed those who lived within her orbit. Portraits of Eleonora in the imperial collections became touchstones of dynastic identity. They appeared in galleries alongside depictions of earlier rulers, forming part of a visual genealogy that celebrated continuity and virtue. Just as Sustermann's portraits, painted in the style of solemn dignity that characterized his court commissions, conveyed her serenity through carefully balanced composition and restrained color. Later painters drew inspiration from these images, reproducing her features in frescoes and engravings that adorned monasteries and churches. Through these works, she became not merely a historical figure, but a symbol of the moral and artistic ideals of her time. Funerary art also played a role in sustaining her image. Sculptors commemorated her with modest yet graceful effigies, often depicting her in prayer. The simplicity of these monuments reflected her own preferences, emphasizing devotion over grandeur. In printed form, engravings of her likeness circulated among noble households throughout the empire, each accompanied by short verses praising her virtue and charity. These images served as private reminders of a public ideal. Her memory thus lived not only in the imperial court, but also in the hearts of those who admired her example from afar. As the century turned, the intellectual climate of Europe began to change. The Enlightenment brought new attitudes toward monarchy, religion, and history, and figures like Eleonora Gonzaga, whose fame rested on piety and moral influence, were often sidelined in favor of those associated with reason and progress. 18th-century historians, seeking to portray the Habsburg monarchy as an enlightened state, tended to minimize the role of religious women. Eleonora's life, steeped in faith and ceremony, seemed to belong to an older world. Yet even in this period of neglect, her name appeared occasionally in historical compendia, usually as a footnote to the reign of Ferdinand II. The reduction of her story to a supporting role reflected the broader tendency to overlook the contributions of women in early modern politics and culture. By the 19th century, however, interest in her legacy began to revive. The Romantic movement, with its fascination for the past and its appreciation of emotion, rediscovered in Eleonora a figure of both spiritual depth and historical importance. Scholars and artists viewed her as a link between the Italian Renaissance and the Central European Baroque, a woman who had carried the torch of culture across the Alps. Writers of the time, captivated by the drama of the 30 Years' War and the grandeur of the Habsburg court, found in her life a human dimension that softened the stern image of imperial authority. Painters revisited her likeness, and composers used her story as inspiration for sacred music that sought to capture the contemplative spirit of her age. Historiography in the modern era has continued to evolve in its understanding of Eleonora Gonzaga. 20th-century scholars, particularly those interested in gender and cultural history, have re-examined her role with fresh eyes. Instead of viewing her merely as a pious consort, they have recognized her as an active participant in the shaping of imperial identity. Her correspondence, long overlooked, has become a valuable source for understanding the networks of influence that connected women across European courts. Historians now see in her life an example of how women exercised power indirectly but effectively, using the language of faith, patronage, and family to shape politics and culture. Her contributions to the arts are studied not only for their aesthetic value, but also for what they reveal about the transmission of ideas between Italy and Austria. In this modern reassessment, Eleonora emerges as a complex and intelligent figure who understood the possibilities and limits of her position. Her religious devotion was genuine, yet it was also strategic, a means of reinforcing her authority in a world where women's influence was measured by moral weight rather than by political office. Her patronage of art and architecture was not merely decorative but ideological, expressing the unity of faith and empire. Her ability to merge Italian refinement with Habsburg discipline gave the court of Vienna a distinct identity that endured for generations. In this sense, her legacy extends beyond biography. It touches on the very question of how culture and power interact in early modern Europe. Comparing Eleonora to other women of the Gonzaga family deepens this understanding. Her relative Isabella d'Este, the renowned Marchesa of Mantua, had represented the height of Renaissance humanism. Isabella's court was a center of art, scholarship, and political intrigue, where the ideals of classical learning flourished. Eleonora inherited this tradition of cultural engagement, but adapted it to a different era and setting. Where Isabella had used art to assert the intellectual authority of a Renaissance prince, Eleonora used it to express the spiritual authority of a Baroque empress. Her Mantuan upbringing provided her with an appreciation for music and painting, but her life in Vienna gave those arts a new purpose: to embody devotion and imperial unity. Through her, the legacy of the Italian Renaissance found new expression within the context of Central European Catholicism. In contrast to Isabella's worldly sophistication, Eleonora's influence operated through restraint and moral clarity. She transformed the ideals of female patronage from the pursuit of fame to the practice of faith. Yet both women shared a common understanding that culture was a form of power. Each recognized that the creation and preservation of beauty could shape the moral and political landscape of their time. Eleonora's achievement lay in translating this insight into the language of the 17th century, a world still recovering from war, seeking stability in faith and art rather than in conquest or intellect. Her position as a bridge between the Renaissance and the Baroque underscores her historical significance. She stood at a turning point when European art and thought were moving from the human-centered vision of the 16th century to the divine-centered drama of the 17th. In her person and her patronage, these two worlds met. The grace of her Mantuan heritage softened the austerity of Habsburg piety, while the grandeur of imperial ceremony gave structure to her devotional instincts. This synthesis became one of the defining features of Central European culture in the Baroque age. The churches, music, and rituals that flourished under her influence reflected not only her personal taste, but also the broader reconciliation of reason and faith, art and duty. The enduring significance of Eleonora Gonzaga lies in her ability to embody the values that sustained the Habsburg monarchy through centuries of change. She gave the dynasty a moral language that linked power to service, majesty to humility. Her example established the model of pious queenship that later empresses would emulate. In Maria Theresa's careful balance of devotion and authority, in Elizabeth Christine's patronage of music and education, one can still trace echoes of Eleonora's influence. Her life demonstrated that the strength of an empire depended as much on moral credibility as on political might. Through her, faith became not only a private refuge, but also a public instrument of legitimacy. Even today, her memory survives in the spaces she helped shape. The convents she endowed remain part of Vienna's religious heritage, and the music composed for her continues to be studied and performed. Art historians trace her influence in the visual language of Habsburg piety, while cultural scholars see in her story a key to understanding how women shaped early modern Europe from within the confines of court life. Her legacy challenges modern assumptions about power, reminding us that influence can be exercised through patience, conviction, and grace. Eleonora Gonzaga's life and afterlife thus form a continuum of faith and culture. From her Mantuan childhood to her imperial widowhood, she exemplified a vision of rule grounded in moral clarity and artistic expression. The generations that followed kept her image alive, not through monuments of marble or bronze, but through the quiet endurance of the ideals she represented. In the end, her greatest monument was not her tomb, but the moral architecture of the Habsburg court itself, a structure built on devotion, order, and the pursuit of beauty as a reflection of divine harmony. Through her, the empire learned that power, when guided by conscience, could aspire to grace, and that the memory of virtue could outlast the splendor of crowns. Eleonora Gonzaga's story begins in the refined world of Mantua and ends in the solemn grandeur of Vienna, forming a life that not only bridged two cultures, but also defined an era. Her journey from a princess of Mantua to Holy Roman Empress was shaped by the expectations of dynastic politics, the demands of faith, and the opportunities for influence that a woman of her rank could seize through intellect, virtue, and careful strategy. What began as a traditional marriage alliance between Italian and Austrian powers became the foundation for a legacy that endured long after her death. She emerged not only as the wife of Ferdinand II, but as a central figure in shaping the moral and cultural identity of the Habsburg Empire during a period marked by war, faith, and renewal. Born into the distinguished Gonzaga family, Eleonora was surrounded from childhood by art, learning, and political intrigue. Mantua, at the start of the 17th century, was still imbued with Renaissance elegance. Her father, Duke Vincenzo I, and her mother, Eleonora de' Medici, ensured she received an education that matched her lineage, grounded in both intellectual refinement and religious instruction. From the Jesuits, she absorbed a deep sense of discipline and devotion, while the cultural atmosphere of her home trained her eye to appreciate beauty as a reflection of divine order. This balance between piety and art would later define her approach to imperial life. The connections between the Gonzagas, Medicis, and Habsburgs placed her at the crossroads of Europe's most powerful families, and from an early age, her destiny was tied to the ambitions of empires. Her marriage to Ferdinand of Styria in the second decade of the century marked the beginning of her transformation from Italian Duchess to Archduchess of Austria. This union was not a matter of affection alone, but part of a carefully planned political strategy. The Habsburgs sought to strengthen their ties with Italian states, and the Gonzagas, in turn, desired to secure their influence within the imperial network. The negotiations that preceded her marriage were steeped in diplomacy, involving not only court envoys, but also the mediation of religious orders that viewed the alliance as a victory for Catholic solidarity. The wedding, celebrated with the grandeur expected of royal unions, also carried the symbolism of faith. The ceremonies, filled with liturgical meaning, reflected the ideals of the Counter-Reformation, linking personal devotion to political purpose. When Eleonora left Mantua for her new life in the Austrian lands, she entered a court very different from the one she had known. The culture of Vienna was more austere, the climate harsher, and the expectations of a future empress more demanding. Yet she adapted with grace, bringing with her the warmth and refinement of her Italian upbringing. Her household soon became known for its elegance and moral discipline. She balanced the formality of the Habsburg court with the artistic vitality of her homeland, surrounding herself with musicians, painters, and theologians. Within this environment, she began to exercise quiet but significant influence, shaping the tone of court life through taste and example. As Ferdinand ascended to the imperial throne during the turbulent years of the 30 Years' War, Eleonora's role expanded from consort to empress. Her coronation symbolized more than personal elevation. It represented the unity of Catholic Europe under the Habsburg banner. The empire, fractured by religious conflict, found in the imperial couple a vision of spiritual and political stability. Through ceremony, portraiture, and patronage, they projected an image of divine order amid chaos. Eleonora's participation in this process was vital. Her faith gave credibility to the empire's claim as the defender of Catholicism, while her cultural patronage offered beauty and inspiration in an age of suffering. During the long years of war, she stood beside Ferdinand not as a ruler in name, but as a moral partner. Her influence at court was often informal, yet it was deeply felt. She served as a mediator between factions, advised on matters of appointment, and offered protection to those who had fallen out of favor. Her sympathy for exiled nobles and religious communities reflected her understanding of power as service. She also became a channel for communication between the court and the church, maintaining correspondence with Jesuit leaders and other clerics. This network not only reinforced the moral tone of the court, but also helped sustain the intellectual and artistic life of Vienna despite the strains of war. Her patronage of the arts during these years cannot be separated from her spirituality. For Eleonora, art was an instrument of faith and harmony. She supported sacred music that elevated devotion, encouraged architectural projects that embodied divine grandeur, and commissioned paintings that combined elegance with theological depth. The works she sponsored in Vienna contributed to the emergence of the early Baroque style, marked by emotional intensity and a balance between grandeur and clarity. Artists from Italy found refuge and purpose under her protection, and in return, they helped shape the visual identity of the imperial court. Her personal life, however, was marked by private sorrows. She bore no biological children, which in an age obsessed with dynastic succession could have been a cause for insecurity. Yet she turned this circumstance into a source of spiritual reflection, deepening her reliance on faith. Her relationship with her stepchildren, especially Ferdinand III, became one of mutual respect and affection. She played a role in his education and moral formation, ensuring continuity in the values that defined Habsburg rule. Her letters from this period reveal a woman of insight and restraint, aware of her influence yet careful never to overstep the boundaries imposed by convention. The final phase of her life, following Ferdinand's death, revealed the enduring strength of her character. As Dowager Empress, she withdrew from the center of power, but did not abandon her sense of purpose. She dedicated her resources to religious and charitable works, founding convents, hospitals, and churches that served both the spiritual and material needs of the empire's people. Her involvement in reform movements within female monastic life reflected her ongoing concern for moral renewal. Even in retirement, she remained connected to the wider political world through correspondence, acting as a discreet mediator in matters affecting her native Italy and the imperial court. The last years of her life were marked by serenity and introspection. She lived modestly, devoting herself to prayer and contemplation, yet her influence persisted in the institutions she had shaped. Her death in Vienna in the middle of the 17th century was met with widespread mourning. The funeral rites held in her honor were solemn and grand, reflecting not only the court's affection but also its recognition of her role in the spiritual and cultural life of the empire. Her burial in the Capuchin crypt placed her among the great figures of the Habsburg dynasty, a fitting resting place for a woman who had embodied its ideals with such grace. After her passing, the memory of Eleonora Gonzaga became woven into the fabric of Habsburg identity. Chroniclers and clerics portrayed her as the model of Christian queenship, humble in conduct, firm in faith, and generous in spirit. Her image, preserved in portraits and medallions, served as a moral exemplar for future generations of imperial women. The institutions she had founded continued to operate, and the music composed in her honor remained part of the court's religious ceremonies. Her legacy lived not only in the grandeur of art and architecture, but also in the quiet persistence of devotion. In the broader landscape of 17th-century Europe, Eleonora represented more than personal virtue. She stood as a symbol of dynastic and confessional unity at a time when faith and politics were inseparable. Her life reflected the aspirations of a continent seeking stability after decades of turmoil. The Habsburg Empire, under her and Ferdinand's guidance, projected an image of sacred monarchy that linked political order to divine will. Eleonora's presence at the heart of this vision gave it authenticity. She personified the idea that moral authority could strengthen political legitimacy, and that faith could serve as a bond between diverse peoples and regions. Her influence on imperial ceremony and culture extended beyond her lifetime. The rituals she helped define, the processions, the coronations, the public devotions, became part of the enduring vocabulary of Habsburg rule. The musical and architectural styles, she favored set patterns for the court that lasted into the 18th century. Through her patronage, the arts became not only instruments of beauty, but also expressions of imperial identity. The synthesis of Italian grace and Austrian solemnity that characterized the early Baroque court owed much to her sensibility. For modern historians, Eleonora Gonzaga's life offers valuable insight into the workings of female agency within dynastic power structures. Her story challenges the notion that political influence in early modern Europe was limited to men. Without holding office or commanding armies, she shaped policy through counsel, maintained alliances through correspondence, and molded public life through culture and religion. Her example shows how women at court could navigate the boundaries of power by mastering the arts of persuasion, mediation, and moral leadership. She demonstrated that faith, intellect, and tact could achieve what force often could not. Her legacy also invites reflection on the nature of the Baroque world. The 17th century was a time of contrasts, between war and peace, reason and faith, grandeur and humility. Eleonora's life encapsulates these tensions. She moved through a world of ceremony and politics while remaining grounded in the interior life of devotion. The art and music she patronized expressed both the splendor and the sorrow of her age. In her ability to unite the material and the spiritual, she embodied the essence of Baroque culture itself. The continuing relevance of Eleonora Gonzaga lies in her capacity to connect the personal with the historical. Through her, one can understand how faith shaped politics, how art reflected belief, and how women contributed to the making of empire. Her example reminds us that history is not only written by conquerors, but also by those who nurture, guide, and inspire. In the corridors of power, her influence was quiet but enduring. In the realm of culture, it was transformative. As scholars revisit her life, they rediscover a woman who turned the constraints of her position into opportunities for lasting achievement. She taught that power can be exercised through compassion, that art can serve faith, and that devotion can coexist with authority. From the palaces of Mantua to the chapels of Vienna, her presence continues to echo in the legacy of a dynasty and the memory of an age. In her story, the ideals of the Renaissance found harmony with the passions of the Baroque, and the strength of empire was tempered by the grace of conscience. Through Eleonora Gonzaga, history gained not only a queen but a moral architect of European civilization.